Welcome to the 6th edition of our discussion series, Radical Diversity, this time organized by the Goethe-Institut Boston. My name is Karin Oenschläger, and I'm a program curator here at Goethe Boston. The session will also be translated into Spanish, and you can access the translation by clicking on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen. In this series, we discuss strategies to a more open, diverse, and just society in Germany and the US. The series is presented by several Goethe institutes in the US, Mexico, and Canada, in collaboration with our Goethe pop-ups in Seattle, Houston, and Kansas City, in collaboration with the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles and the Institute for Social Justice and Radical Diversity under the sponsorship of the Heinrich Böll Foundation North America. Today, we are joined by an anthropologist of Turkish-German descent and by the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. Welcome, Sultan Dugan and Rachael Cerrotti. Thank you so much for being here today. Let me quickly introduce our moderators. Max Czollek is joining us from Berlin, where he works as an author, poet, and theater maker. His essay collection, De-Integrate Yourselves, transformed the debate about the integration of minorities in Germany when it appeared in 2018. Mohamed Amjahid also joins us from Berlin. He's a political reporter for the weekly newspaper Die Zeit, and in 2017 published his book, Among Whites, What It Means to Be Privileged. Our discussion will last 90 minutes. And you in the audience will be muted, but you can post your questions at any time in the Q&A box. And we will get to your questions about, maybe in between the discussion, but mainly during the last 30 minutes of our webinar here. And please feel free. We really would like to hear from you. Post any questions you might have. We are looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks again to all of you. Thanks for joining us. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you. And over to Max, I guess.
Mohammed, the other Max, Max and Moritz, we say. Max and Mohammed, that's the new Max and Moritz in Germany. Thank you, Karin, so much for this introduction. Thank you for having us in Boston, even though only digitally. Max and I are delighted to present to you our new talk today in our talk series, Radical Diversity. And we are delighted to welcome our two amazing guests that I would like to introduce very briefly. And then we would like to discuss Muslim-Jewish homogeny and basically also ask what that is in the first place. So welcome Rachael Cerrotti. She is an award-winning photographer, writer, educator, and producer. She has spent over a decade researching and retracing her grandmother's Holocaust survivor story with an intention to explore and document the intergenerational impact of migration and memory. In 2019, she released her critically acclaimed podcast, We Share the Same Sky, which tells this story. And I hope we will discuss this very important project later with you, Rachael. Her memoir by the same name as the podcast will be published this coming August. Rachael currently works as a creative producer and digital storyteller with USC Shoah Foundation. Welcome, Rachael. Also, a warm welcome to Dr. Sultan Dugan. She received her degree in anthropology from UC Berkeley. Her scholarship is concerned with religious difference and citizenship after the Holocaust in Germany and continental Europe. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies and the Department of Anthropology at Boston University. As part of her postdoctoral tenure, she is teaching a course on memorial and human rights in post-Holocaust and post-slavery contexts. She is also the co-coordinator of Encounters, a lecture series in the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies minor at Boston University. Welcome, Sultan. And Sultan and I, we actually know each other from your time, Sultan, in Berlin, where you made your research, also your fieldwork among self-organized Muslim and Jewish initiatives in Berlin. And I have two questions for you. Maybe you can tell us when Muslims and Jews are finally going to take over Europe. Maybe you have an idea about that, and then maybe give us a little a little overview about your work in Berlin with those self-organized initiatives.
Yes, 1 second only, just for you all to also hello, Max, great you all came. Just to give you a short idea of what's happening now is Rachael and Sultan are going to give a short introduction to their work, and then second, Mohammed and I are going to pitch in again, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then you all are very warmly invited to ask questions in the Q&A section. So great to do that again. Next series going on, and thank you, Sultan. Please go on with the question. I didn't want to interrupt you.
Well, thank you, Max and Mohammed, and thank you, Goethe-Institut, especially Karin Oehlenschläger and her team, Bettina and Lena, for organizing this, for making this possible. Despite all the restrictions, I think there's something amazing about being connected on Zoom, where you can actually, I already had a friend and colleague from Harvard University contact me in the chat. So just to have the space to have the conversation and to, both get ideas out, but also to think again, collectively is really enriching. So to Mohammed's question about Muslims and Jews taking over Europe, I mean, this is both hilarious and I should say interesting question, to be asked that in this time. And partly because, I mean, you could phrase it as a satirical, funny question, right? But it is a question that is there. I mean, I had to see during field work when I came back in 2014 that I actually arrived in a very changed Germany. So the background for everyone here, I grew up in Germany. I grew up in Western Germany. I studied in Berlin, and while finishing up my MA, and I had already studied in Chicago and in different other places, I came to see more that there was a memory problem in Germany. I wouldn't say like an amnesiac problem, but more like there was a lot of, display. The Holocaust became more important in public space. There was the memorial, obviously. There was a debate before the memorial was built among historians and those who were involved in that building. But at the same time, and I would say this kind of intersected with several transnational developments. One was, I would certainly think, the global war on terror. And the other thing was the Second Intifada in Israel-Palestine, that being Muslim appeared and emerged in Europe, in Germany, and also globally as a problem of security. And so when you ask me, Mohammed, and I take it as a joke question, right? When you say, when will they take over? I mean, we also have to keep in mind that Jews and Muslims have been in continental Europe, in the geography of Europe, long before we have this idea and the kind of very geographic territorial imagination of Europe as we have now, right? So Jewish and Muslim presence is older, right? But this anxiety over Muslims and Jews taking over, I think it goes back to two very different genealogies in Germany. One that obviously has ended in the Holocaust, right? That these older sentiments of Jews are taking over and all these conspiracy theories we know that were made about Jews. But the other thing is that, and this is when I came to do my field work, the changed Germany that I found was that being openly anti-immigration and anti-Islam and anti-Muslim was something that drew many 100,000 people to the streets with Pegida and concerned citizens. But I also, I have to say, I came to do my field work in 2014, right after the Gaza war. There was a war in Gaza in 2014 in the summer. I was doing exams in Berkeley. I was preparing, I was reading up all the stuff on citizenship and, habitus. And I was in this very intellectual place. And in front of my eyes on Facebook, there was all that stuff happening, which, I was not personally there, but I would read these news and I would see things happening also in Germany. And what happened for me with my fieldwork is that I had prepared to do fieldwork on Holocaust commemoration that also draws in Muslim migrants. When I arrived in Germany, what I found was that the organizations I wanted to work with, they were waiting for new funding, and they had actually applied to do preventive work on Islamic extremism. So, and here comes the interesting thing, that many of these demonstrations that this war drew out on the streets were somehow led by Palestinian community organizations, by mosque organizations. You know, Berlin has one of the largest Palestinian community. And I did not plan to work on Palestinians specifically, and I didn't. But all of a sudden, I saw that this whole logic of the global war on terror and how it came together with anti-Semitism actually enabled and opened up certain funds to go after Muslims as a population in these programs. So I started working with two of these programs. First, because the interesting thing for me was that they kept saying that the people they work with are not extremists, they're teenagers between 12 and 18, but they want to prevent them from becoming extremists. So, okay. But then what an extremist was, and an Islamic extremist at that, was also not always clear. And that was actually when most of the problems appeared. So when you ask me, and this is like where, I mean, my fieldwork brought me to like many different places. I mean, Neukölln was one of them. The Salam Shalom initiative was one of them. Schools in Neukölln, schools in Kreuzberg, schools in Wedding. But what I saw, I think, specifically was that there was certainly more concern, more fear, also among those people who actually did that work as Muslims, who came in with that identity to do good work, democratic work. They were worried about themselves. And with the Salam Shalom initiative, I saw something I hadn't seen before. I have to say that there was collaboration between Germans who identified as Jewish, as Muslim, who wanted to have a voice, a standing in public to say, look, there's something that concerns me here, also as a religious minority or a member of a religious group, but I don't know how to talk about this yet. I don't know what kind of politics I should have. So there was a lot of possibility there, which really drew me to the Salam Shalom initiative in the beginning. And I did a lot of work with them to also do reflection, to just like, okay, what is going on? What is the situation here? Because I noticed that I had been out of touch. The 5 years I was gone in the US, I had stayed with a Germany that I kept in mind, coming back, seeing that things are far more hysterical in a way, you know, far more urgent and threatening. So yeah, let me stop there for now.
Sultan, well, thank you so much. This would already open up a whole box of things we could unpack and talk about. For example, talking about how, like, the way you described that also was that the stage had been changed. The personnel on the stage had changed, right? In the 90s in Germany, there was different groups, the others being labeled in a different way than they were increasingly being labeled after 2001. And especially after Sarrazin's book appeared, where the construction of the Muslim other became dominant, whereas in the 90s, when I was growing up, there was no Muslims really. There was no real public representational Muslims. And I find this extremely interesting because in a way, those figures have become so familiar that we feel like they have been around always, but they haven't. And in the 90s, it was more like the Arabs, the Turks, and the others, and the asylum seekers and all that, which is much more central in constructing the threat from the outside. And then its connection to the what I've been calling, with the word of a friend, theater of memory, which is combined with a theater of integration. But let's talk about this in just a second and kind of draw Rachel into the discussion, because I think, especially talking about the construction of memory, we're talking about a dominant society, dominant German society, constructing itself through telling the story of the Jewish victim. And I think, at least I'd like to think, that we have been working, and Rachel herself as well, on telling a Jewish perspective on that history. Because we may agree the history has to be told, but there's different ways to tell it and different functions that it may serve. So Rachel, I'd be very happy if you give us a bit of an idea of the work you have been doing and then take it from there.
Sure. Well, hi, it's nice to be here. Let's see, my work starts a long time ago as well. Back in 2009, Obama had just become president, and I was a bit of a frustrated college student, didn't like where I was, ended up at the wrong university. But the one thing I knew for sure is that I was going to be a photojournalist. So I was running around, moving from country to country with my camera. And during that time, like every young storyteller is told, they say, choose a story and start a blog. So that's what I did. And I chose my grandmother's story because my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, that I grew up in a family where that was very well known. She was the matriarch. The story was not hidden. She spoke in communities, at schools. She gave her testimony to archives like Gratz College and Shoah Foundation. But I really wanted her story as she would tell it to a granddaughter. And I also had this idea of here's a story I could take on professionally that no one else can take on because it's my family's story. And when I sat down with her in 2009 to start collecting her story, it really honestly was a very simple idea, was let me collect this, record this. I made a silly mistake and didn't record it with audio, but just wrote. So she would talk and I would write. And really, it was a nice opportunity for the two of us to do something together. Fast forward a year later, she passes away. And that was around the time that I discovered this absolutely stunning archive that she had left behind. So there were diaries and documents and immigration papers and deportation papers and report cards from the times of her childhood and photographs dating back to the 1920s. And I became entirely obsessed, maybe to an unhealthy degree, where I spent the first half of my 20s just on a bedroom floor, digitizing and literally retyping every diary entry. And at that time, I would say that the story, I felt as though the only timeliness that there was to it was for the Jewish community, because for a long time now, we've been very concerned about that generation passing away. And so over the years, I got deeper and deeper into it. I got further along in my career, and in 2014 as well. So, the timing here is a bit coincidental. I subletted my apartment and moved to Europe with this intention, this very lofty intention of retracing her footsteps. And so I thought I would go live in every country she lived in, and I would engage with the people who saved her life and search for the descendants of people who saved her life, because what I knew very deeply about my grandmother's survival story was that it was unique in the sense that she was saved by strangers. She was not in a concentration camp. She did not witness death. And therefore, immediately, the memories that I inherited of the Holocaust were of upstanders, were of the power of small actions and the ways that ripples and echoes throughout history and onto the next generations. What I found when I got to Europe is, I had this idea that people thought I was a little crazy. I was like, I'm going to move from one place to another and follow the same modes of transportation. And I went out with a sketch of what I was going to do. And what I found across Europe, primarily in Czech Republic, Denmark, and Sweden, and she survived the war in Scandinavia, was that I found all of these families there that had intersected with my grandmother's story, some of her generation, some were the descendants, and all of them had been telling the story in their family. I think this is unique, but it was quite magnificent. And it's one of the reasons why that 1 year of travel is still ongoing, even though right now it's a digital travel. And what I found, in Denmark was I moved in with the descendants of one of the women who took in my grandmother. She was able to get to Denmark on a rescue mission for Jewish teenagers out of Prague. And they had been passing down the story from one generation to the next. And this idea of it was really good story in their family that they saved somebody. And then when my grandmother was a part of the rescue of the Danish Jews, which is quite a unique story in the context of World War II history, as Denmark saved 95% of their Jewish population, I was able to find people who were on that journey with her, and the family of the fishermen in Sweden who found their boat that had been lost at sea. And there's longer versions of these stories, of course. And when I went into this storytelling with this very possessive attitude that this was my story, this was my family history, almost like navel gazing at the trauma, which I think that oftentimes many communities who have gone through persecution can do. And what I found was that it wasn't my story, it was collectively our story. And in regards to memory, the memory wouldn't have been there for me to explore, and it wouldn't have been there for me to heal and interpret in different ways if other people didn't care about it as well. And over the years, I mean, that was 2014 to 2015 was this first major year of travel. In 2015, the refugee crisis broke out and came to the forefront of international media. So meanwhile, I'm digging into this story of history that feels very linear at that time. And then suddenly in 2015, colleagues of mine, friends of mine are being sent to Europe to photograph this new refugee crisis, and headlines are starting to feel similar to what I was studying. You know, I was really obsessed in the early part of this research that I could travel from country to country without showing my passport. You know, I almost had this young person's frustration that, like, I want stamps in my passport, and nobody wanted to give it to me because the Schengen area. And suddenly, you know, move into 2016 or summer of 2016, and I had to show my passport to get from Denmark to Sweden, and you're starting to see the rhetoric change and the conversations change, and people started getting into a very heated conversation about compare and contrast, and what are you allowed to compare and what are you not allowed to compare. And so in this sense, the history keeps changing. It keeps evolving, and I feel like my role as a storyteller is to try to keep up with that. And it certainly feels the case this year in 2020 as well with the pandemic. So when I work with students, you know, there's a whole new context to teach World War II history and a whole new context to memorialize it because of what's happening in the world today and some of the themes that might feel similar, but how do you explore it while leaning into the similarities without attaching the two histories to each other, but more looking at them in a more holistic view. So I'll pause that there, but that's a bit of the background of what I've been doing with my memory work.
Yes, thank you so much. Can I ask one more question, just for also to kind of maybe build this connection? Did you on your travels ever encounter a sense for, because I totally see what you mean, like possessive attitude, saying it's your story, it's a collective story, it has been saved by many different people, but, and I don't want to ask this question in a way that's already answered. I'd rather like to know, have you encountered this story serving different purposes or functions in the different families and countries you have seen? Because I can imagine in Denmark, as far as I know, the story of saving the Jews is serving a very specific idea of Danish self-construction, which today, in connection to the present refugee crisis, is also being used as a screen to kind of block off any accusation of being racist. For one example, I don't know if that mirrors in the individual experience you had, but I'd be interested to hear something about the feeling you had for the position or place the story took in each respective family you saw.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that part of it is an expectation that you set for yourself, right? So Denmark set a very high bar for what they do for humanity during that rescue. It doesn't mean that, you know, Denmark wasn't involved in wars in the past where maybe, you know, the humanistic approach wasn't as good. I mean, every country has been on, you know, different ends of history in that sense. But I think that story being as powerful as it is and as unique as it is in the landscape of World War II history is that you have this very high bar of what's expected from society when it comes to people who are seeking help and seeking refuge. And so I think that there's a pride that comes in helping others. There is an expectation of self. And so, you know, that's very different than another country's history that perhaps doesn't have that in their past and therefore are trying to overcome certain missteps they took in years past or generations past, and they're trying to do better. And I think in Denmark, it's trying to live up to the expectations. So anything that falls short feels wrong, where perhaps another country has a different measurement of success in terms of taking in people who need refuge and who need a safe haven and a place to be. I think the same question is regarding family reunification. And so when the refugee crisis really, you know, came to Scandinavia, which, you know, more people were trying to get to Scandinavia during this recent refugee crisis, just as in World War II, it was a safe haven, and you're seeing similarities there. I started refocusing a lot of my reporting from my grandmother's story and these families that I had met to current refugees today in Scandinavia, young people who fled without their families and were trying to find a life because that's what my grandmother did. So I was trying to look at these thematic similarities. And so rather than focusing my documentary work on the young people themselves, I would look at the individuals who took them in, who made them feel secure in this country, and who helped fight for their family reunification, because Sweden has a long history of being very good to refugees and offering that opportunity to reunite families. And so in recent conversations, as politics have been shifting to this more anti-immigrant rhetoric, that those policies are coming into question. And so I think that looking to their past, there's this expectation that they will do better. Whereas, here in America, for example, we never let a lot of refugees in. That's part of our political history, is that we kept people out. So we don't have that high bar to reach up to, but we're trying to do better, hopefully, than what we've done in the past.
I mean, it's so interesting to just listen to you, because last Yom Kippur, I was in Sweden, in Malmö, and arriving in Copenhagen at the airport and just taking the train, and just existing there was very interesting for me, because they were like, oh my God, there is a brown person going from Denmark to Sweden. And I think a lot changed in the last couple of years. I have an observation. I would love to hear your thoughts, because for a text I analyzed speeches by German politicians talking about the last remaining Holocaust survivors, and being very stressed about the fact that many of the survivors are passing away, actually. Actually, a lot of those politicians in Germany are very concerned, oh my God, what we are going to do without these people who were there and go to schools, for example, and tell our kids that we were bad people. And it's so crazy that some of those politicians are haunting Holocaust survivors to take selfies, actually. You could see them in their social media feeds. I don't know how I should feel. Can I feel sorry for those old people that they are bothered by politicians who want to take selfies with kippot? I don't know if you observe the same thing, or how do you read this also? Is it this emotion of we are going to lose something, and we are going to lose also control of how to talk about this memory? Maybe Sultan, I don't know if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, no, there's a lot here. But on starting from your last question, this is really interesting. This idea of we need the survivor, like the identity as survivor, and ideally a Jewish survivor, not a Roma, not a political, the Jewish survivor. We need that person to tell that story, how bad it was and how they still have survived. I've seen this in action several times. I've seen it in action in schools with kids who afterwards actually just couldn't understand what the problem then was. They had difficulties thinking about the problem. And I think part of the problem here was that there was a missing language of race, and how being Jewish became a race in Europe, and how talking about racialization as a particular process that happened with certain minorities in the European continent cannot be fully talked about. What we want to talk about, and that's basically what the politicians are after, I think. And that was also interesting for me to hear from one survivor. I mean, I'm blanking out on her name, but she's actually centrally exhibited in the Otto Weid Museum in the Blindenwerkstatt in Berlin-Mitte. She said, I don't know what these politicians want from me now. I can tell them the story, how we hid, how we became non-citizens, how our papers were not worth anything anymore. But I feel I have to tell them the story that, yeah, Margot Friedlander. Yes, no, not Margot Friedlander. No. Inge Deutschkron, exactly, Max, thank you. So for her, it was like, which part? Because, you know, the other thing is also like, you narrow down this person's life and the political conditions she had to deal with. Like, should she talk about the stage where she was in the concentration camp, about all the people who smuggled goods for her so she could actually survive, about how she was an employee at the Blindenwerkstatt, which part? And that's the thing, right? When we think about Holocaust history, it is a huge history that goes into all kinds of structural processes of making both Germany as a Nazi Germany as it did, and also of excluding Jews all the time with all processes, right? But for that, you need to have a notion of race, and you need to have a notion of like race as something that is a product, not something that is natural. I mean, we all agree on that. But that language, that form of analysis is almost taboo. I mean, you know, even the German word Rasse, you cannot fully express it, say it without causing a scandal, I think. That's one thing. The other thing here also is that, you know, when we think about, I mean, I think Max is really spot on, right? We're going in circles since the 90s in a way, right? And there was no Muslim, you know, problem in the 90s, right? And actually, you know, even my socialization, I wasn't socialized into a Muslim problem. But now as it stands, and now as it kind of has these intersecting moments with like the Jewish community, we have to come to think about what this means that we go in circles. What does it tell us about Germany, given that we have this history that we can talk about, and we are really attached to these survivors? We want them to tell us more and to understand. And at the same time, there is a clear dissonance with what is possible in thinking about certain minorities again. And I think with Rachel's example of the refugees, I think maybe this is one example so that I also want to bring from my fieldwork. You know, a year into my fieldwork, the refugee crisis hit. There was a refugee crisis already in Southern Europe, right? But, you know, Germany and France had managed well, and Scandinavia had also kind of not gotten the brunt of it. Now we saw so many people marching in, demanding their rights, their human rights. One of the NGOs I worked with, they were like, we have to respond to this. We have to kind of exhibit this, because the people who come here, the young people, they want answers. They want to know about this. They ask questions. And, you know, with young people, if you're not able to engage their questions, they will go on the internet and they will find any kind of information. And that can be dangerous, right? If you don't have a way of thinking about certain problems. So what happened, and two things happened here, and one is connected to this Holocaust survivor that I saw in action. One is a Holocaust survivor that I did not see in action. The Holocaust survivor, Marion House, I think was her name, one of them. She managed to go to England with the Kindertransport, and her story was central to this exhibition. And they talked about more details about her life after she basically went to England in the Kindertransport. And I said, okay, and I saw some pictures, and there was some photos about the Mediterranean now, but no personal story about a refugee today. So they asked me how I liked the exhibition, and I said, look, I mean, I think it's great. You've expanded on Marion's story and how she has survived. That's a good story. That's good to know. That's important to know. But at the same time, I don't see any other, you know, contemporary engagement. And the person who designed that exhibition, she said, look, Sultan, I tell you what, when I open the newspaper and I see how many people drown in the Mediterranean, how many people are stuck between borders, I don't know what story to tell you. And with Marion House, I feel this is a good story. It has a good ending, as brutal as it is. And she started crying in front of me. And I had to understand that we're in a time, the problems are far more massive. And we know we have this history in the background, and yet there's very little moment to intervene, very little power that we have as individuals. The second thing with the survivor, the Holocaust survivor who came to the school, and the kids had the chance to ask her, but they couldn't grasp the problem. We did a whole trip to Auschwitz and back. And when I interviewed them and I said, you know, what did you take from these stories? Like, what do you see? What do you see from these experiences? You've also met a Holocaust survivor. We've done all these reflections. And what was fascinating for me was that from the 20 students that I could talk with, 5 of them who were ethnically German, they said, we know this can happen again. I was like, okay, how? How would that happen again? They're like, well, all these Muslims who came, all these refugees, they could put us in concentration camps. They could kill us. And this was so amazing to me that this was their takeaway from this history. You know, and I felt that, okay, we're doing something wrong. And a major part of this is not talking about race as a conceptual term, not talking about the structural conditions of how Jews are not simply just Jews. They are also made Jews from a German perspective, which is a racializing perspective.
I'll jump in there to say, you know, on the context of, in the conversation of race, I get to work with a lot of students here with my grandmother's story, and I've taken all this documentary work and try to create curriculums out of it. And the podcast is being taught in an effort to bring a contemporary and a first person narrative to history. So it feels relevant to these young people. And it's increasingly difficult to talk with young people, especially in the Jewish community, to talk with young people about the idea of race in the context of the Holocaust. Because when you ask them, how do they relate to their Jewish identity? You know, Judaism, to be Jewish is to be a funny minority, because you're like, what am I? Is it a culture? Is it a tradition? Is it a religion? Is it a race? And I grew up in a secular Jewish community that I feel very culturally Jewish, but I wouldn't say religious per se, although some of the traditions drift into that zone, certainly. You know, I was just this past week talking with a group of 7th graders, and they're just starting to learn about Holocaust history and trying to answer this question that every single one of them has, is like, why the Jews? Why did people hate them? Why did people kill? How could you do that? These very simple questions that no one really can seem to find the answers for, and trying to explain to them, like trying to teach them that they are a race when they don't feel like they're a race because their enemies, or not the enemies, but the oppressors say they're a race, is a very confusing thing, because to teach the history, I have to teach this way of identifying that doesn't match up with the way that they've been raised. And so, and in fact, I have to teach something that the culture has not taught them or does not necessarily believe. And of course, you know, the running joke is 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So, you know, whatever I say, take it with a grain of salt, that someone might have a different take on it than I do. But it feels very strange. And as an educator, I have to ask myself, well, like, what is my role here? Do I teach them that Judaism is a race, and that's why everybody was thought to be killed, and that's why this genocide happened? Or do I come at it from a different angle? But I think this is very counterintuitive, is that how do you teach a group of people that they're a race when they're growing up, especially in America as it is today? And, you know, to the point that students these days, you know, and I feel like old when I say things like that, but it wasn't true when I was younger, and I'm not that much older than these students, that they can pull out their cell phones and see everything, and they access information much quicker than I do. And that's they've been raised into the world of a cell phone. So they're seeing everything that's happening in America with racial relations here, and how the African American community is treated, and Islamophobia. And they see themselves as, you know, white privileged people. And yet here I come teaching them a history where their race is persecuted, and it doesn't make sense. And so I think that this is a really confusing question from inside the community as well.
Yeah, thank you for I think the turn or the development this discussion has taken, because maybe something that pops up in both of the points you make, the important points you make, is that we can see there's some kind of entanglement of the Jewish and I would like to say the so-called Jewish and the so-called Muslim side, because there's obviously a self-defined Jewishness and a self-defined Muslimness. And this is very different from the way otherness is being produced by each respective dominant culture. So talking about Europe, especially about Germany, the Jewish position is being constructed as and Mohammed pointed to that, as a very crucial position for a self-definition of the German identity after 1945, especially since the 80s. What you can see is that the Jews and the Holocaust have become central to the construction of a new, better Germany. because in a way, building the Holocaust Memorial meant to build a new Germany, build a new identity, idea of the self of Germany. And that was like the basis for something that has been called the normalization of national feelings, which kind of culminated in this World Championship of Soccer 2006, when everyone was taking out the German flags and saying, we can be proud to be German again. So that was something that was based on the memory work, and Jews have had and are still demanded to play a very specific role. And I think that'd be one answer I would give for the search for the survivor, because that's the most authentic and most like the stuff that grants you the most credit if you want to construct something like this. And then on the other side, you can see in the present that Jews and Muslims are being targeted at the same time. You see that from the right wing happening all the time. You see that in the States as well. And suddenly the whole, and that is a very US idea, the whole idea of whiteness of the Jews, becoming white of the Jewish side, is being called into question by the attack that is being carried out by the right wing, which apparently kind of takes away the idea of the Jews being the most successful minority, which has been something like a narrative, which in Germany, if you try to transport that to a German context, would be the storm has passed for a Jewish minority, and now it's going to be the Muslims. I think both is not right. I think in both cases, Jews are trying to believe something, and the dominant culture is trying to propose something which is not true, which serve the idea of overcoming anti-Semitism, but it's more an idea than it is an actual act. And you can find that in attacks on a synagogue in Halle last year, in attacks on shisha bars this year, and those people usually have a sexist, racist, anti-Muslim, and anti-Semitic worldview, and you see how both faiths seem to be interlocked. It almost feels like either there's going to be a future for the Muslim and the Jewish side in Europe and in Germany, or there won't be for either one. And that, I think, may open up a position that is making our conversation possible and much more important than just having a discussion between two minoritized or othered groups. So I'd be interested to hear something, like to hear your thoughts, especially also for the American context on those things. Maybe it doesn't work. I don't know. Give me a few things.
Well, I'd like to just jump in very quickly and say that I think that one thing that we're leaving out in the context of this conversation is that there's plenty of Jews that are not white, right? And so that's an important conversation that has been gaining some voice in this, recently in America, is like, there are plenty of African-American Jews. And what about the whole Sephardic population? I mean, oftentimes I think when we talk about Jews, like, we make this assumption that everyone's from Eastern Europe or has my complexion, and that's not the case. And so I think it's also really important to think about what is the identity of a Jewish person who does not identify as white, and then what they're facing many different minorities at one time. So I want to make sure that that's also part of the conversation.
Yeah, I can add to that. I mean, from like maybe a bit from both perspectives. I think, Max, what you're saying is really interesting, because I think there's, as I try to exemplify with the Holocaust survivors, there is a kind of deployment of the figure of the Jew, right? In the way it can work for the majority, right? Okay, they can become white if they're fully assimilated, if they're certain middle class, if they live in certain parts of the city, if they contribute, right? That's the American narrative. If you stop asking for religion, right, then Jews can pass. But if you look at Europe, and if you look at how Europe has a different genealogy of racialization, and we have to think about, when I say racialization, I mean, I also want to be like really clear, like, racism and racialization make race. I don't think that Jews are a race or that Muslims are a race. There are so many ethnic differences, linguistic differences, and I thank Rachel for that, addition of like, geographic, skin color. But in Germany, I think the kind of work that is being done through the figure of the Jew is that Jews are already secular and assimilated. Why aren't Muslims as secular? Why aren't Muslim communities assimilating in the same way? And, you know, I've been seeing this exceptionalizing narrative also among the AfD, who like think of the Holocaust as an exception and everything else you can be proud of in German history, and everything was fine with the German Jewish community. But, you know, the question here is, what is the work, the figure of the Jew, not just the real person? I mean, and that's also a problem with Holocaust survivors when they come and talk with Inge Deutschkron, who was supposed to give a narrative about how the Germans had resisted. She turned the narrative around and she said, look, you're exhibiting 4 pictures of survivor helpers. This is like, you know, a certificate of moral poverty, given that there are millions of people in Berlin who have not helped Jews, and millions of people in Germany and Europe, right? So what are you proud of? What do you want? What is the work that you want me to do here, right? And the tour guides couldn't respond. I mean, it was like, okay, we have to think about this. But what I'm trying to tell you, and maybe also confirm what you're saying, is that, you know, being Jewish in Europe, as it is imagined as you have citizenship, either from Israel or in a European country. You are middle class, you are not religious, you're assimilated. And then what happens, if there's a circumcision debate, as there was, then there is a surprise. Oh, Jews circumcise their children as well, like Muslims? Oh my God, really, why do they do it, right? And you know the surprise, what is surprising in the surprise is that even in Jewish studies in Germany, there are voices who say Jews should know better than doing this, okay? Or when you say, you know, there are actually Jewish groups who don't shake hands with the other sex. You know, and here, this imaginary Jewish figure doesn't work anymore because it collapses with the figure of the Muslim in its practices, in its ways of being in the world, which is, yeah, to a certain extent, traditionally shaped, right? And then it becomes a problem.
I think it also, you know, just
do you want Rachel? Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I can.
No, go ahead, Rachel.
No, I would say it goes back to just many points earlier of this like fear of this generation of Holocaust survivors passing away, right? That's been, I feel like, been a fear for my entire life. And I still know many who are very well and telling their story or not telling their story as they have their choice to do. And, you know, I think one of the questions or 2 things I'll comment on that is, one, I feel like we need to give everyone a break. Like the Holocaust survivor generation has done so much for us. I mean, you know, I say it all the time, you know, one of the reasons I'm fascinated in Holocaust studies is the most well-documented genocide from the side of the perpetrators and the victims. So, you know, the Holocaust is not the only genocide that has happened in the 20th century. There are genocides happening now, but we have this case study here that we can really study in a way that is unlike other genocides. And for that, we have a responsibility to study it. So that's one. They've done so much for us. I mean, working with Shoah Foundation, we have over 55,000 testimonies, and, you know, 50,000 of those are Holocaust survivors and witnesses. So, you know, a big thank you to them for giving us their stories and allowing us to be able to explore it in this type of depth and have these types of challenging conversations. But I think the other thing with that is when we think about studying this history and looking at contemporary politics or culture in this context, is what's the point of studying the history, right? So if we are repeating the narrative over and over and over again about concentration camps and showing the footage and talking about how evil people can be, it's like we're getting, you know, it's a textbook on evil. Whereas if we study rescue missions, if we study, you know, upstanders, if we study what went right in a landscape where everything seemed to go wrong, you know, we have a very different skill set in terms of dealing with what's happening with the world today. And I think that also is a question that more time needs to be spent on, is like, what is the reason we need these stories so badly, and what are we going to do with them? Because I think, you know, most people on this, we've all made the point that like they can be come at from so many different angles. So I think more time needs to spend on not only telling the story, but picking and choosing why are we telling the story.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I just wanted to remind the audience that you're welcome to ask questions. We already have some, and we will get back to them soon. And talking about stories, Max and I, we suggested today a kind of a counter narrative, if you want, with the Muslim-Jewish hegemony. I would be very happy if you could share your thoughts, like when you heard maybe for the first time about this term, what you were thinking. And I just want to share a very short and small story about 2015, actually, as a reporter in Hungary. I was sent there when a lot of people arrived, a lot of refugees arrived from the Balkan route to Hungary. And when this myth of Germany, it opened doors and is being so generous, emerged, knowing that no one opened doors because these people were actually in the Schengen area. When we start to talk about refugees welcome, basically in Germany, that's the first thing. And the second thing, the myth of Angela Merkel taking 1 million people as a mother, where we need to acknowledge that a lot of those people were sent back to Albania because not all of them, they were from Syria, for example. So this 1 million people was like a very strong image. A lot of white Germans actually used to show that now Germany actually became the good guy in the middle of Europe. Anyway, in Budapest, they were trying to survive actually, and we were in the city, and the police was actually collecting brown bodies from the streets and putting them on trucks, and the trucks were heading towards the east of the country where there was a camp, and they would put all those Syrian refugees in this camp where they didn't have any food, anything, any dignity actually. And as a reporter, I was in a conflict. What should I do with my 5 Syrian protagonists for my report? So I picked up the phone and I called my Jewish friends in Budapest. And I said one first sentence. I said, look, Dora, I have 5 Syrian refugees with me and we might need help. And her answer was, I know what you need now. Don't worry. She exactly knew immediately what I was talking about. And her whole congregation opened up the synagogue and they were hiding, like these 5 Syrian refugees, they were hiding in the synagogue to be actually not taken by the police. So this is what I was thinking when Max and we were talking about Muslim-Jewish hegemony. I didn't need to explain the situation to my Jewish friends in Hungary. So this is what I think this term can offer actually as a counter-narrative. And maybe you can share your thoughts if maybe this is a good idea to also. I know that Max, for example, organized a very interesting and also funny festival with a lot of Jewish and a lot of Muslim voices. So what do you think, can we or should we work with such terms like Muslim-Jewish hegemony or allyship, for example?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. I mean, thanks, Mohammed. I think the allyship part is an important part. I think, there is solidarity is needed, right? And I think if we talk about Jewish-Muslim relations and we want to be critical with what those relations imply in a Europe today, where many people are, they're careful about what they say about Jews, not because they think so different. They're policing their language not to be anti-Semitic, but they're not, applying the same care when it comes to Muslims, right? They speak their mind in a different way. So Jewish-Muslim hegemony, I mean, like what you just described is that you had a friend who could help you out and who understood what it means to be a refugee, right? I mean, in that sense, that solidarity that was extended by her helped these refugees. But I think what we're also seeing here is that the condition, and I think this is like really the point that I want to drive here, the condition of being racialized, of being a refugee, of being completely demonized and others othered, these conditions, Jews know them as a community. They have a historical consciousness of that from the victim side. But these things are not over. They exist for Muslims. They exist for the majority of the world, you know. Maybe not with all the elements of the Holocaust, but with like many threatening parts, like, you know, refugee camps, like not having a visa, having to show a passport that can pass, being, you know, I mean, like the videos that appeared from the jungle 2 weeks ago. I think these are all appalling moments. You know, we cannot act. And, you know, saying Jewish-Muslim relations, I mean, we also have to keep in mind that, you know, the world becomes a very small place when we say Jewish-Muslim, right? The Muslims we talk about, and also the Jews we talk about, they're far more heterogeneous politically, but also like ethnically. And who is considered a bad Muslim or a threatening Muslim? When you think about like the kinds of incidents that happened in Germany with refugees, it was always very clear, oh, what are these Moroccans doing? They're all rapists and they're drug dealing, like the language that comes out, right? And then it was attached to like Muslim masculinity, as opposed to, look, yes, Moroccans are not Syrians. They cannot apply for asylum in the same way. But they're also, where they live, they are under extreme social duress. There is poverty, there are no opportunities, but yet, you know, going to Europe is a life-changing force where they are, you know, basically in the channels of so many grinding bureaucratic mills that they become Muslim on the one hand and they become illegal on the other because they have to go into, you know, hiding and smuggling and what have you. Right. So, but to kind of take this and apply this term Muslim, you take away a lot of complexity and you take away a lot of political and social condition that made these people be outside of their kind of national and social context in Europe and be seen as Muslim. Right. I mean, there is that. I mean, like in my own work, I try to not fully go there. I mean, I was drawn into this refugee thing for a long time because I saw how that fueled this Muslim or Islamophobia. But the other question that I'm interested in, and I think here Muslim-Jewish relations can do something, is to think about what is the status of religious minorities, non-Christian minorities in Europe today. Are they equal? So when we say hegemony, what kind of hegemony do they have, right? So I really like what Max is doing with the Maxim Gorky and Jüdisch-Muslimische Kulturtage. I think it's very productive and provocative, but at the same time, it also conceals a certain reality, how Jews and Muslims are granted rights and legal status as religious minorities in Germany and in Europe today. I think there's not one country in which they're officially a religious minority. And in Germany, the legal status of Körperschaft des öffentlichen Rechts is given to Jews in the early 90s because of history, not because they're simply a Jewish minority, because of history. And it's not given to Muslims. So we have to think about these things if we bring together these terms.
Thank you. I'm just lose a few words on the Jewish Muslim hegemony because it has been raised a few times, and then Rachel, I'd be great if you jump in also. Maybe what I'm about to say now is even opening up for like going down this path. So the Tage der jüdisch-muslimischen Leitkultur, that's what hegemony is, a very not like perfect translation of this term Leitkultur, which is a fighting term by the right. It has been used to demand of minorities to integrate. The idea to behave in a specific way because society is going to fall down if the other, which has become Muslimized, isn't behaving in a way the German behaves. And that's an interest, it's a curious twist after the 20th century because behaving like the German behaves isn't exactly a wonderful role model. So what you need is a real reconstruction of the idea of what being German means, because it's not the 20th century, right? So now you need the good German, which is the German that has redeemed itself, that has become better. And for that, you need the Jew. And this is how history has become in Germany, at least in parts, a almost like a point of reference that allows you to be racist in the present. Because in a way, to become another German, you can demand of other people to adopt, you can be dominant, you can dominate them because you have become better. Because who has done this great and horrible thing as the Germans did and has come back? This is how the German story works. And the question from a Jewish side would be, do we want to play this game? And I think this is where we started at. This is where deintegration, which was the term before the hegemony, the Leitkultur, and this is where it came from, to say, look, okay, I see why the German side wants to do that, but does the Jewish side want to affirm that? Is that the society we want to live in? Because in a way, we are being played. The Jewish symbolic Jew is being played against the Muslim other. Jewish, Christian, Leitkultur, Abendland. This is how they say it. Suddenly there's a Jewish history in Germany, right? Suddenly it's being recognized. And against that, we're wondering about counter narratives, because I'd argue that society has become different, that society is radically diverse. This is true for the States much longer than it is for Germany, or to put it differently, Germany just had a major setback in the 30s and 40s, which left it much more homogenous than it used to be in the 20s. So we are building up on that again. And now we've reached a point when this kind of diversity has become real again. And not only real in the population sense, that was real before, but also in the sense of belonging, of participating. And now I think I'd argue we've reached a point when we can reimagine society in a way that it's truly pluralistic. And for that, we'll have to get rid of specific German imaginations of the political and of the homogeneous and of all those things we've been talking about. So in a way, the Jewish side as well as the Muslim side, I think, should have an interest on reimagining society, because I mean, you can take two things from 20th century from a Jewish perspective. One would be, we need more police cars and more weapons in front of synagogues and Jewish institutions for them to be secured more. But on the other side, you could also say, we don't need more secure Jews, we need a different society, because this is going to be the only thing that's going to keep us from being persecuted and discriminated against. And I think this is where the minorities kind of overlap. And this is where I think art has become a space, at least in Germany, that allows for this reimagination, because the political concepts are still very much lagging behind. They're still very much in the past. And they're continuing down this idea of a false promise of homogeneity and dominance of one specific culture, which is simply not real anymore. So just to give you a bit of a conceptual framework. Rachel, I don't know if there's anything to connect to.
Well, no, I appreciate that, because I'm the lone person in this conversation who doesn't speak German. So any explanation of these large German words you're saying is much appreciated. I think a couple things. I think, you know, when you study the history of the Holocaust, I think one of the things that often shocks people, you kind of have to go back in time. You know, I've always taken issue with the fact that the Holocaust is taught like it's 1939 to 1945 in this, you know, bubble of history where, you know, I would say the survivor story doesn't really start till 1945 when they've actually survived the war. And, you know, there's lots of stories to be explored there. Like, for example, when my grandmother came to America, to keep a long, complicated story short, you know, she had her affidavit took her to the South, to Cincinnati, which is kind of the border of the South a little bit. And, you know, she was confronted with racism towards African Americans. And she ended up getting kicked out of the first home that she was in here because she befriended a Black man. And the reality was, like, you know, that's part of her survival story, was that as she went from country to country, she had to re-understand, reteach herself what her identity was in the context of a different community, right? So you can understand your identity. I can understand my Jewish identity as it is to grow up in a you know, a liberal community in Boston. But when I go to Europe, I have to re-understand, or you know, I have to teach myself in a different way what my identity is and get comfortable with that. And, you know, I have students today young people, high school students, who say when they go to Europe, their families, like, they take off any Jewish star that they're wearing, or they take off any identifying Jewish symbols. And I think for you know, an Ashkenazi Jew, for someone, you know, who looks like me, it is easier to assimilate, because you can just remove what makes you different in a way. But there's something that it does to you psychologically to force yourself assimilate, to be scared of showing who you are. And that comes out in conversation as well with people. And also to the point of before World War II, I mean, that's talking about post-World War II, but before it, I think people forget that Jews had never been more assimilated in Germany than before the Holocaust. I mean, especially after World War I, where all these Jews were fighting on behalf of Germany and getting medals of honor. And I mean, it was only in the recent decades before that they even gained rights as citizens, full rights as citizens. And so, they almost let their defenses down. And so what does that teach people today, Jewish people today, is like, how dare you put your defense down? And I think that's part of the reason that, there's a very strong storytelling tradition in Jewish culture. And I think part of it is to remind yourself that like this happens over and over and over again. So if we let our guards down too much, we're at risk. And, that gets passed from generation to generation. So, the whole study of, epigenetics and how do we change, we kind of are brought up to be a bit scared of who we are, even if we're assimilated into where we live. So I think that's a piece of it. And then to speak to the relationships between, Muslim people and Jewish people, I studied abroad in Israel, and I had friends from all over. And after college, I worked with a peace building program in Israel and worked with Palestinians and Muslims and Christians and Jews. And for my Muslim friends and I, like, there were so many cultural similarities. I mean, values and traditions and ways of life and even the foods we don't eat and rituals and whatnot. When we were together, these differences are fun. These differences make conversation interesting. These differences mean that you have more culture in your life when you let people in, but then you go to the world outside of that friendship or outside of that dynamic, and suddenly, I get home to America from Israel, and the first question people have is like, oh, did you feel safe? Did you feel threatened? Or, it's the rest of the world projecting this story that they've been taught onto you. And most often the people projecting that narrative of hate or discontent with each other or fear of each other are people who are not in either community. And I think that's an issue when it comes down to storytelling and creativity. Art is a way to break down these barriers, is to talk about the similarities, but also talk about the fact that differences aren't scary. Differences are wonderful. Differences is what makes the world interesting. And being able to, be excited by each other's differences and not fear it, I think is something we should all be striving for. And I think art is a really important way, and storytelling is a really important way to gently move into that space. I think doing it politically feels very challenging for people, but I think doing it from a story-oriented space is a much more approachable way of creating that relationship.
Thanks, Rachel. I would suggest that we...
Can I say something?
Go ahead, and then we take some questions.
Yeah. Okay. To Max's question, I think, okay, now I understand also like the Jewish Muslim hegemony a bit better. But, the question of Leitkultur, and people who know Germany know that debate. But, this is the scandal of Germany, I have to say, to come up with this debate in the first place. Back then it was dismissed, but we're actually in this space, right? Because when you think of it, and I think I saw it in some of the comments, and Rachel, you just said it, that assimilating itself, which you described as letting your defense down, letting your guard down, is not a solution. And in fact, when you think about the promise of secular citizenship, you're supposed to be equal regardless of your religious background, regardless of your religious difference. There should be ways of translating some of your traditional practices into certain institutions so you can be equal like a Protestant person in Germany or a Catholic person in Germany, right? So the question, it needs to be asked the other way around. It's like, how come there is the promise of citizenship, there is emancipation in Jewish history, or there is, conditional citizenship for Muslims in Germany, for immigrants, but yet there is this narrative. There is this one hand giving and the other one actually wanting something very different, which is, I don't trust you, and I'm not going to let your kind of difference. I mean, when you I had to like really think, reimagining a different society. You know, Max, I mean, I think you have a lot of freedom in your life and in your personal, individual position. If I would say something like this, you know, I would be like looked at like, what do you want? Do you want to Islamicize? What is it? You know, it is not read in innocent terms. If you're Muslim, you're presumed guilty in Germany. There's always people read an agenda to you. And I want to say this, during my fieldwork, many people thought I have an agenda, especially that I said, I don't know yet what I will say with this research. I'm still figuring things out. No, there was no innocence for me. There was a lot of suspicion. So asking that question, can we imagine a different society? I would say we are in the society we have, and we have to ask, how come certain people who do a certain kind of work, who have a certain kind of background, are not public in Germany, don't get to speak about this. This space we have, I'm very grateful for this space. You can believe that, because this space I'm not given in Germany. And I'm not given in Germany because my voice and my perspective is not valued. Partly because I have a working class background, I have a guest worker background, I have a Turkish background, maybe also because I'm a woman, I don't know, but because I'm conceived as Muslim. And I have to assimilate, I have to go all the way to speak. Okay, if I say, look, what you're putting at us as a task actually is a problem, then I'm out. I'm excluded again.
Absolutely, Sultan. Thank you so much for this, putting this into perspective. I think there was one. Let me start replying to questions and saying what questions we've already replied to, and then say what we haven't, and then try to have you answer them. So there was the question about assimilation, which Rachel really addressed, and I just want to even take it from what Rachel said and say, if we learn, like if we understand that assimilation is making us vulnerable to the state, its persecutions, then it's not only beautiful to be different, but it's what keeps us alive. And I think that, especially in the German context, is extremely provocative, because the whole paradigm of integration works as the central concepts for the others to become a part of society. There's no real concept in staying different. And I think that up to the present day, Germany tells the story of minorities, also the Jewish one, as one of becoming the same. And I'd argue that maybe there's much more to be learned about how Jews stay different and how we do stay different now. And this is taken into what you just said, Sultan, and that is a question that was posed directly to me, what artistic spaces I see that are being more progressive than, and Rachel talked about storytelling, that'd be something that in Germany has changed in the last, let's say, 7 years, which is when Gorki Theater came into place as the first state-funded theater running on a program called Post-Migrant Theater, when suddenly a space opened up that started to do art for a different audience. It reinvented theater in Germany for a non-specifically like dominant German audience. Suddenly you had people who were calling themselves post-migrants, so migrants in the second and the third generation, still being racialized, still being othered, to kind of come to theater and reimagine Germany and its narratives. And that was the framework that only allowed for me as a Jewish person to enter the debate in a different way. Because up to that point, for me, my only audience was a dominant German audience. I couldn't imagine any other. So in a way, you're right in saying that I have the privilege or the freedom to say something that you may not be able to do, but also there's limits to my expression, which a post-migrant position has been opening up. So I'd be arguing for this allyship also in a sense of using the different possibilities to say things and to raise issues in order to reimagine society. And I think art in Germany right now is a place to do that. Yes, but yeah, sorry. Yeah, Rachel.
I just love to add to that very quickly, because I think it's an important point, is that one of the struggles that I've had with my work over the years is that it's very easy to convince Jewish communities to bring me in to speak, or to bring me in as a teacher, or to listen to the podcast or whatnot. There's a very obvious connection. There's an obvious care and consideration. And I think that, yes, it's important to teach this history to people who come from this history, but I think it's just as important, if not arguably more important, to do this storytelling with people who don't come from this history, especially with my approach where it's not, it's looking at where are our intersections of history. How do we break out of these exclusive narratives that we tell? Like, it's very hard to tell a story of this history without it being categorized as a Jewish story or a Holocaust story. And as soon as you say that, a lot of people tune out, or they assume that they know what you're going to say. And I find that to be a very big challenge. And, in recent years, it's broken open a little bit, but I would say only because I've been able to produce projects that are on a more, like a larger scale, because they go on, Apple Podcasts or whatever, versus, just me talking to a crowd. And so I think that these types of relationships that we're building here today, this conversation that we're having, one of the things that's so important about it is that when we come at it together, we can look at the similarities, we can look at the differences in a really loving way, but also certain people might be attracted to hearing my story that now we're going to hear Sultan's story, and vice versa. And so I think that that's the other value, is that you bring in a much wider audience when you have a more diverse set of storytellers coming together at one time.
Yeah.
Max, I got the message that my connection is a little bit shaky. Maybe you can start with the questions from the audience. I hope that people will hear your voice better than mine.
Thank you, Mohamed. I think we're very smoothly replying to questions that have been asked. Like, we got already 2 or 3 questions being answered by just the way we've been talking about assimilation. We've been talking about art as a place. So now there's a few questions which are very political and analytical, and I'm not even sure if this is like how will migration panorama change with the exit of Angela Merkel? Blankly speaking, I don't know. I think that this is all about also who's going to follow on the CDU hat as the next person. I can't really tell you more. I think we should maybe focus a bit more on this group. There's one question which I find interesting that I think is more for Rachel, which is how important is it for Holocaust survivors to tell their stories, and why are secondhand stories not regarded after death? Not sure I understand, but maybe you do. What is that about?
Well, I think that we're covering a lot of it. I mean, I think that they are regarded. I think the question is, let's see how to phrase it. I gotta think for a second. I think it's very important for Holocaust survivors to tell their story. Of course, I don't think there's any debate or argument there. And certainly the Jewish community has made every effort plus more, and not just the Jewish community, to make sure that those stories are not just told, but recorded over and over and over again. I think the challenge, I'll speak to the challenge that is happening now, which is when you inherit stories, or when you're further away from the conflict, you're going to have a different perspective of it. So my mom and I believe she's listening to this somewhere out there in her home, we've gone back to where my grandmother's from together. And, I'm lucky to come from 2 parents who are both very interested in their families' backgrounds, which is 4 different countries in Europe, and looking way back when. And it's a different perspective. And I know it can be challenging for the second generation, for the children of Holocaust survivors, to hear the perspectives of the 3rd generation. But we have more distance. The pain is not as heavy. The reflection is a bit, it's a bit more broad, a bit more connected to other communities. We see, I'm speaking very broadly here because not every 3rd generation would agree with me, but at least in my communities, we see this inheritance as a responsibility and less as a burden. And I think that's when storytelling changes. When you see the story that you're given as a responsibility to dig into those themes, to dig into what it means for the world. How do you stop it from happening again, right? We say never again over and over, but like it almost falls on deaf ears when you look at what's happening around the world. So how do we reevaluate what that actually means? But I think there can be, and rightly so, there's some challenge from passing a story from one generation to the next. And I think that that's perfectly okay. I don't think it's a reality, and it should be explored, and we should talk about it with the same, the same love and care that we're having this conversation right now, where there is no right or wrong way to interpret it. And so I guess I'll just say that, where I think that it's okay that we have, even within our own communities, differing opinions or differing pains and challenges, and how to keep these stories alive and keep having them help heal the world.
Thank you, Rachel. Cool. Wonderful. There's another one for Sultan and Mohamed, if he's able to answer, which is, I mean, if his internet is able to transmit his answer, which is asked by Anna Skarpelis, which is, I've long admired your approaches to race in Germany, Sultan and Mohamed. What do you think could or should an engagement with race look like from a distinct German positionality? What do you say about that?
Go, Sultan. Go.
Okay, I mean, I know Mohamed has this famous book about, you mentioned it in the beginning, like being alone among whites, I think.
It's among whites, and there's another one coming in March, but
okay.
Go ahead.
So, you know, I have to, like, I really appreciate that question. You know, Anna is also a colleague, and I should mention this, like, I do this work not in a vacuum, obviously. I have several colleagues who do amazing work in Germany, some in like very related places, also on like, you know, anti-Semitism and Jewishness, and, you know, Palestine is one thing that also a colleague does. But also like the question of being Black or being German, right? And many of us are not in Germany. I want to emphasize this. Many of us don't feel fully comfortable to talk about this in Germany. But I should also say the kind of work we need to do, I think, needs to grow out of understanding Germany and how it functions in its different institutions. So I personally don't use the term white. I appreciate Mohamed does, and I think it helps with his work. But I think that term, for example, needs more translation. And he has alluded to that in his own book. I personally, I work with the framework of secularism. And I look at what are the institutions that basically invite religious difference, but invite it as a problem and put a lot of work on these members, right? I mean, one historical example is Jewish assimilation, as we all know. But this, for me, I call this a secular conversion process. So again, contrary to what we think in general, this goes beyond Germany. Citizenship does not simply grant you rights and equality. It actually puts a demand on you. It tasks you. And this task is different in different places. And in Germany, the history, you cannot fully disentangle this. I think entanglement is a nice term, actually, that Max used earlier, from Holocaust history and German Jewish experience. So the kind of work that needs to be done from a German positionality is to acknowledge the difficulty to talk about race, the difficulty to actually just apply certain concepts that grow out of US slavery history into Europe. I'm not saying that there's no racism skin color based, there certainly is. But if you want to do this work in Germany, you have to understand the institutions and the kinds of practices that create inequalities, socially and politically. And this would be like my plea to think about race making in Germany in its variations. So you can still look at it in intersection with, like, you know, migration, being from Africa, being from the Middle East. But within the continent itself, and this is, again, the interesting thing, if you turn it into a Jewish-Muslim relational space, that you see something that you might not have seen earlier when you just talked about Turks or Palestinians or what have you. So this would be my plea, working through the logics here.
I hope you can hear me. I will try and talk very briefly. I think it's an important question, first of all, and then acknowledging actually that there is a German positionality. I felt in the last 3 years that a lot of white Germans feel uncomfortable by just listening to me speaking about Germany, because I'm not supposed to do that. So that's the first thing. I use the word white, yes, as a political term, as an analytical term, just to make things visible, things that are not visible right now, actually. And in my new book, I have a whole chapter about Erinnerungskultur, how we talk actually, and make politics, talking about the Holocaust. And I know that I will get I will get in trouble because of that. In the past, when I was analyzing actually German Erinnerungskultur, a lot of white German people, they told me, what are you talking about? You're not supposed to talk about this, you know? You as a brown Mohammed man, immigrant, whatever, mit Migrationshintergrund, whatever, you are supposed, if you want to live in Germany, you are supposed to take some of our guilt, because this is your task, Leitkultur. Here again, integration. You have to go out in the streets and clean, for example, one of those Stolpersteine and take a selfie, because this is how you perform by being German, actually. But you're not supposed to analyze, or even worse, politically talk about Erinnerungskultur. And this is like something where I understand that a lot of white German voices, especially those who are in positions of power, they don't think about themselves as white beings, as German, because it's like, it's very, I think sometimes it hurts them listening to me, but listening also to Max, actually, or Sultan, or listening when, I don't know if you spoke, Rachel, if you when you were in Germany with a lot of Germans, or when you were traveling, it hurts them a lot. And to be honest, I love somehow to hurt Germans. I don't know, not physically, of course, but by talking, because this is also healing, actually. And I believe in this critical perspective of color, trying just to mirror something that a lot of minorities live from day to day. Sometimes it's very, very simple.
All right, thank you, Mohammed and Sultan, for this statement. I think that could open up a whole new round of talking. We don't have time for that, unfortunately. And I would like to do something, closing this up, that we haven't done yet. At least I haven't done it yet in the series of the things I have moderated, which is ending with one last question, which we won't reply to because I think it's impossible, but I think it's important to think about it, which is, will there come a time when we identify as human instead of titles and banners? When does humanity unite as a single force for its own survival? Humanity has a much greater threat than our myopic view of each other. When will we move on? And I just want to release you with that into the US, or wherever you are, noon, and in Germany into the night, which is already pitch dark here. Thank you very much for being here, Rachel and Sultan. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Goethe, for organizing this. Birch Foundation, as always, Thomas Mannhaus. Mohammed, great to be with you. Reunited again. We have done single moderations now, so great to be reunited now. And let me just, you audience, thank you for being here and give you an idea of what's going to happen next year, which is, we're going to have 3 more shows. It's going to be one in New York on January 27th, a very fateful date, at least in Germany. We have San Francisco on February 17 and Washington on March 10. If that was too quick for you, just go to the Goethe website. You're going to see the dates. Also, we don't really have the panel yet set up yet, but it's going to be amazing as today. Maybe not just as amazing, but almost as amazing as today. And I just want to tell you, have a great Hanukkah, have a great Christmas, have a great New Year, and please stay healthy and wear your masks. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. See you soon, I hope.